Well, folks, welcome. I'm Charles Osgood Force. While I was around, everybody called me CO. I'd like to be remembered as the man who donated the first land for this cemetery. I gave 30 acres, and you're standing on some of that now. Now, I was a widower, and I was married to a widow, to Mrs. Smith of Rome, Georgia. We came down here in front of those Yankees that were coming in at the time, and this is my wife's daughter. This is Fanny Smith, later Fanny Weisenbaker. And Fanny wrote a diary about those turbulent times in the 1860s.
Oh, yes, I did. And I called it Impressions of Valdosta, 1863 to 1865. And I began it with these words: the war cry was in the land. From time to time, I would record things that I remembered about those times. Well, now, during the war, there were a lot of things that young people did to keep themselves entertained. We had candy pulls and sing-alongs, and sometimes we'd wheel the piano right out on the front porch so the whole town could hear and join in.
Fanny, that was an interesting diary that you wrote, and I bet people would enjoy reading it today. Why don't you tell them how they can do that if
Oh,
they'd like
thank
to?
you, Father. They do have my diary at the public library. You can't check it out, but if you ask for it at the front desk, they'll be happy to show it to you.
Now, Fanny, you probably remember the old courthouse that was down on Central and Ashley Street. It was an old square wooden building. Really wasn't satisfactory. We tore that down. We built that beautiful brick courthouse right in the middle of it, the square down there. Of course, at that time, business had pretty much come to a standstill in Valdosta, and we had a lot of families coming in from the northern parts during the war, and then later on, the southern troops started to come in and drift in sort of one by one, and Valdosta began to really grow at that time. Now, I'm sad to say that my young son was one of those boys who came down here. I call him a boy because he just never did grow up. He just couldn't get used to Reconstruction and the loss of the war, and he kept fighting with those Yankee occupation forces. And they put him in jail once, and he escaped, and they shot him in the belly, and he died a rather bad death, I'm afraid. But, you know, death came quickly in those days. My young daughter, Kitty, got ptomaine. She didn't live through the day. But anyway, we did an awful lot of building while I was around.
Surely did.
Yeah. And the cemetery wasn't the only thing I donated land for. I donated a lot for streets. You may be familiar with 4th Street here in town. But anyway, folks, we love Valdosta here, and I appreciate what you've done with Valdosta. You've kept it up. It's beautiful. The cemetery is gorgeous. And Fanny, I guess we better say goodbye to our guests now.
Well, goodbye. It was so nice to meet you and talk a little about my Valdosta.
And folks, if you'll step right next door, Mr. Varnado, I'm sure would be glad to see you. Thank you for coming.
Many of my students were children from some of Valdosta's first families. They were the Middletons, the Pendletons, Weisenbakers, the Converses, Varnados, Holidays, and many, many, many more. Rural families had to rent places in town so the children could attend the school. Mothers often came and they would stay the entire week with the children, and on the weekend everyone returned to the farm. The boys and girls, they all dressed in their best for school. The boys would wear stiff shirts, and the girls were all dressed up in fine, crisply ironed, fresh calico dresses. William Pendleton was an early student at the Institute, and he wore his Confederate uniform to school. The only clothes the boy had to fit him. My 2 daughters taught at the Institute, and from time to time my 2 brothers would help out. When my 2 daughters got married, they had to hire teachers to take their place. Since there were no church buildings in Valdosta at that time, I invited the various denominations to meet at the school. The Methodists, they accepted my invitation, and the others, well, they would meet in the courthouse and other large buildings downtown. We got our first church building when I gave funds to purchase a large warehouse on East Hill Street. And the Presbyterians made a very, very nice church out of it. It was located across the street from today's Miller Hardware store, and that's also downtown. David Comfort was the first pastor, and I was the first elder. Now, here's my son, James.
Thank you, Father. Father died very suddenly on a day in April of 1870. We missed him terribly. I was in Quitman at the time, and I returned to Valdosta to complete Father's school term at Valdosta Institute. William Pendleton helped complete that year. Valdosta Institute was bricked over, and the city assumed control in 1895. I lived in Valdosta my entire life, but I did serve in the Spanish-American War. There's lots of Spanish-American War veterans here in the cemetery. I was proud of my time in the Army. So proud, as a matter of fact, that I took my second wife on a honeymoon to Cuba, and the war wasn't even over yet. But that's another story. Mr. T.S. Mackey is interested in meeting with y'all, I'm sure. He's still going on about that nephew of his, John Henry Holliday. Y'all might remember him as Doc Holliday. Mr. Mackey is waiting on you. Thank you for stopping by, and good day.
Thank you.
Well, as J.O. told you, I am Thomas Sylvester Mackey. And yes, I am John Henry's uncle. But I sure hope you remember me for more than just that. You know, John Henry was born in Griffin, Georgia, but lived here from ages 12 to 21. There have been many stories told about him, and I guess some are true. I will try, however, to dispel one myth. It involves the famous swimming hole incident. When my family came here during the war between the states, with the Hollidays, we bought property west of Valdosta, right up to the river. John claimed a certain portion of that river as his own private swimming hole, and he guarded it well. Now remember, I was with John on one occasion, and I had my pistol with me, even though it was Reconstruction and we weren't supposed to have weapons. On this particular day, when John and I got to the river, we found a passel of strangers playing in that special swimming hole of John. Now, you may have heard a story as to how it all blew up into a sort of massacre. People saying things like, when the smoke cleared, bodies were everywhere. No, folks, it just didn't happen that way. John did fire his pistol over the heads of those boys and yelled, "Get out of my swimming hole! Now get!" They got. You know, John was a good boy, really. But he lived in turbulent times, and he did lose the one person he ever truly loved. That was his mother, Alice Jane. Isn't it sad that she may have exposed him to the lung disease that killed them both? We Mackeys and Hollidays stayed in Valdosta, as did many other families who refuged here. We all helped build up Valdosta after the war. My sister-in-law, Mrs. W.H. Mackey, and her children and I built the Mackey Building downtown at the corner of Central and Patterson. That building is owned now, I believe, by Christ the King Episcopal Church, so you all may know it. I was the contractor for that building and for many others in Valdosta, including the Carnegie Library, which was designed by Lloyd Greer and built at a cost of $18,000. I had a reputation.
for being very careful with the dollar, and I prided myself on the care I took to spend it wisely. I was the contractor for the Lowndes County Courthouse, that majestic structure built in 1904, 1905, and when I finished that job, I had 12 bricks left over. 12 bricks. And I got a good price for them. My goodness, I need to stop chatting, taking too much of your time. There are others, many others waiting to talk with you. Well, it has been my pleasure to meet you here on this, the 76th anniversary of my death. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello there. It is so nice to see you good people. Thank you for stopping by. You know, I worked for the McCrees for a long, long time. I reckon you could say they were my family. I had a real name, but I didn't much use it. I knew it, yes I did too. My mama gave me my name and I was very proud of it. I was named Isabella Ferguson McCree, but I was always known as Ibby or Aunt Ibby. Yes, I did. Well, we lived several miles west of Valdosta, what came to be known as Kinderloo Plantation. When Mr. George McCree's wife died, she left him with 4 boys to raise. And his sister, Miss Lou McCree, moved down here in with him. And she saw those boys grow to manhood. Oh, they were well educated and well thought of too. Yes, they were. Well, the word Kinderloo comes from the German word meaning kinder, kinder for children. And I reckon Kinderloo means children of Lou, since Miss Lou raised those boys. Well, after the war, all things got pretty hard in Valdosta. I would get up before 4 o'clock in the morning, and boy, I'd make some biscuits. I would make some good biscuits. Oh, Miss Liz McCrae would help me to make those biscuits too. We had a hard time, but we had a fine time too. Oh, we'd get those biscuits and some fresh buttermilk and take them down to the railroad workers and sell them those biscuits. My, were those biscuits good, if I have to say so myself. Oh, when the train engineers started approaching Valdosta, they would blow those whistles loud and clear, letting us know they coming. You want some buttermilk and biscuits. Oh, Miss Liz McCrae says she reckon they're gonna call this Biscuits and Buttermilk George instead of Valdosta. Oh, Lord, did we laugh about that? Well, they laid me to rest right in the family plot. And I guess my name should be Isabella Ferguson McCree from Biscuit and Buttermilk George. Well, you know, things keep on changing. Things don't stay the change. Y'all know that. Those old Langdale people have gone out there in Kinderloo Plantation and built some big old gorgeous houses and a big old golf course. You ought to see them. Need to go see them. Well, old Mr. Roberts over there, he just itching to talk to you. He got something to talk to you about. And thank you for stopping by to see Aunt Ibby. I hope you have a good day. So I don't have any buttermilk and biscuits to give you. Run now.
Good afternoon. My name is John Taylor Roberts. I was born in 1850 and I died in 1920. In 1827, William P. and Sarah Knight Roberts, my grandparents, moved here from Wayne County. Their son, William Roberts, was my father. He married Margaret Devane and they had 4 sons and 4 daughters. 1883, I married Miss Kate Young. Kate was the daughter of Reamer and Mary Wick Young. I then opened up a hardware business, selling buggies and harnesses and things like that. That eventually turned into the automotive business. 1893, Kate and I bought the old Weisenbaker house on Wells Street. That house, built in 1845, was older than Valdosta itself. You know it now as the Roberts House. A non-profit organization, the Heritage Foundation, is in the process of restoring that old house to its former beauty under the live oaks. My beloved wife died in 1929. Both of our funerals were held from that house. I had 2 boys and 7 girls. They were William Leland, Kathleen, Maydell, John Young, Stella, Margaret, Edwina, otherwise known as Midge, Leona, and Mary Reamer, nicknamed Dinah. My family knew me as a very strict disciplinarian. Trust me, with 9 boys and girls, discipline was necessary. I believe that children should be seen and not heard. Many a time I would walk into the dining room in the evening, just so much noise I could not even hear myself think. I'd be so flustered I couldn't remember my kid's name, so I'd just yell, "Daughter!" and it got good and quiet in there. I once berated Kathleen for propping her feet on the stool and asking a boy to tie her shoe. How brazen can you get? Dinah and a guest, I sent them out of the house because they were too loud. Those boys of mine, they could also be noisy, and sometimes their language was unacceptable. I once put them in a closet because they were so noisy. Words like gosh and darn, they were never tolerated around my house, and my kids knew what soap tasted like. I served 6 terms as city council before I ran for mayor in 1906. I was then elected to 5 consecutive 2-year terms. While I was mayor, milk and meat inspection had begun and the health department was formed. I had Dr. King come here as the first inspector. The paving of city streets had started, and in 1913 the South Georgia State Normal College was started construction. The city vowed $5,000 a year for 10 years towards its construction. Also, the Carnegie Library was built on West Central Avenue. That's now the home of the Lowndes County Historical Museum. You know, I think the biggest issue I had under my tenure as mayor was the liquor question. There was prohibition rallies with people for and against the sale of liquor. And one night at a city council meeting, there was a 3-3 split decision whether to keep open, or close the saloons. I voted not to close the saloons. Of course, it need not matter. Voting still went on, and the whole state soon went dry. I was proud of all of my children. William Leland owned Builder Supply, and John Young ran the Buick Agency. All of my daughters, except for Midge, attended high school and college. See, Midge, she was the sickly one. The doctor said she wouldn't live to be 21, then 40, then 55. She lived to be 72 years old. You see, she had a disease that solidified her bones and she couldn't walk. So what we did was we would put her in the open limousine and ride her around with the chauffeur and the neighborhood kids. She loved it. She had a great time. Then World War II happened. We had gas rationing, and that meant we couldn't just ride around for no reason. So Midge was restricted to the house, and she never left the house again until October of 1953 for my granddaughter, Leona's wedding. You might know her better as Lonnie. She married Albert Pendleton, who was a beloved historian here in Valdosta. Well, I've really enjoyed talking to you about us Robertses, and I hope you've enjoyed listening. Thank you and have a great day.
That was one heavy elephant, or my name isn't James O'Rourke. She knelt on me. She crushed me to death. I can't begin to tell you how many bones in my body were broken by that elephant. She sure did me in. I bet that to this day you hear about that poor elephant from her point of view. Now, I may have been drunk when she got me, but I sure did not kill her. They did. Yes, sirree, the good citizens of Valdosta killed that elephant. Now let me tell you my side of the story and how it really happened. Gypsy, that was her name, Gypsy. She was an old circus elephant and a big girl. I was her keeper. Now, I admit I did drink a bit, maybe too much, and I may have been hard on Gypsy when I was in my cups, but she had no reason to kill me. She was my family, so to speak. My wife had left me and I was all alone except for Gypsy and the circus people. Just like all families, we had our fights. Now you will hear that I beat her, and I'm sorry to say I did, sometimes. She would make me so mad sometimes. But that's the way it is with families, don't you know? The Harris Nickel Plate shows came to winter in Valdosta in 1902, and Gypsy and I came with them. It was a cold November day, and I was riding Gypsy between the train and our winter quarters in Pine Park. I had had a bit of whiskey that day, and I was maybe too drunk to be careful. I just sort of fell off Gypsy around Central Avenue and Tomb Street.
Yeah, Mama.
Sometimes she was kind enough to pick me back up with her trunk and set me back on her head and shoulders, but I guess she didn't like it when I drank. She just knelt down on me. Then she rolled my body down the street for about 50 yards. I tell you what, she sure surprised me. As you can imagine, a crowd started to gather, and Gypsy got so agitated she sort of went berserk. She tore up the town, you might say, and half the town followed her and kept her stirred up. There was a wild and woolly chase up and down the streets of Valdosta and on out Bemis Road to the north. The chase went on for hours until dark and continued the next day at daylight. Police Chief Dampier was with the posse when they found Gypsy in a field near Cherry Creek. He took careful aim
Papa.
from about 75 feet and felled Gypsy with one shot. A number of other shots were fired. Now you know what I meant when I said the citizens of Valdosta killed that elephant. They did. They buried me in fine style that afternoon, and Gypsy too. I hear it took 12 men working hard to dig Gypsy's grave. I had a circus band for my funeral. Once in a while, my old circus pals would come and visit me when they were in town. They'd stand around my gravesite and tell a few old jokes and stories and just have a bit of fun. I kind of miss those old pals of mine. Well, time passes. Now, if you will, I'd like to direct your attention to the archway over there. That's the entrance to the Hebrew Cemetery section of Sunset Hill. And there's Abe Pearlman coming out to greet you. I'd like to thank you for stopping by today and hearing the story of me, James O'Rourke, and Gypsy the elephant. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Well, I welcome you. My name is Abraham Pearlman. I was born in 1885 and I died in 1931. You want your own chair, don't you? I'd like to share with you a little bit about the early years of the Jewish community here in Valdosta. The very first Jewish person to come to Valdosta was Mr. George Ehrlich. He arrived here in 1870. He came here from Germany. He searched all around the country to find a suitable place to live before deciding that Valdosta, Georgia was the place for him, a place where he could raise a family and start a business. He was followed shortly thereafter by Mr. Emanuel Engel. Mr. Engel came here, and supposedly the story goes, I don't know if it's really true or not, but this is the story, that he was only here for about a week when he courted and then married a local beauty, daughter of a prominent Valdosta family. I don't know if that's true or not, but if it is, it probably caused quite the scandal, I can tell you. Well, other families followed, and by 1908, there were enough Jewish families here in Valdosta to officially create the Valdosta Hebrew Congregation. I and my family arrived here in 1910. We were still too few in number to have our own house of worship, a synagogue, so we worshiped in our places of business downtown or in people's homes. One house in particular that we used was that of the Goloveskis, located at 304 East Hill Avenue. The friends of mine, such as Morris Handelman, Hal Mazel, Abe Goloveski, and I served as the religious leaders of the community, but we also served as prominent and well-respected and well-known business leaders of the community too. And in fact, your history books say that as well. For example, you might know that I, Abraham Pearlman, founded the South Georgia Pecan Company, a going concern that's still in existence today. And I hope you have been to my company and had some of my pecans recently. Have you? Well, very good, very good. And of course, with Christmas time not far off, I hope you'll go back to my company and buy more pecans. They make great presents. In any case, in about 1920 or so, we were of sufficient number to have a full-time rabbi named Rabbi Miller. We also now did have a synagogue of our own located on Smithland Place off of Lee Street. Eventually, though, we outgrew this facility and we sold it to the Salvation Army. Of course, this was after my time, as they say. In 1960, we broke ground for a new synagogue located on Bay Tree Road. And it is a facility still in use today, a very fine house of worship, and one I will hope you all visit if you haven't done so already. And I know some of you have there, so I appreciate that. In about 1930 or so, we decided to approach the city of Valdosta to see if we could purchase some land here in Sunset Hill to form a Jewish section of the cemetery. I approached the city fathers and they agreed to sell us some land here. And we located the cemetery, as you can see it, located right in the archway, right over there. It says Valdosta Hebrew Congregation Cemetery. That was in 1930, and that was very good timing on my part because I died in 1931. So, perfect timing. I became the very first resident of that section of Sunset Hill. And I must say that I rest in that section very happy knowing that the work that I and my colleagues engaged in has been a part of what we have today, which is a great city, one that is open and tolerant and progressive and full of civic pride. And it's very, very edifying to see that that is the case. So I want to thank you all for your time and attention here. Shortly you'll be meeting Mr. Chauncey Hudson, a friend of mine, who will tell you about his home and his family and his business as well. Until then, I wish you a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And welcome to the Hudsons in Sunset Hill Cemetery. My name is Chauncey Hudson. I asked our guide to bring you over this way to talk to you because I didn't want you to walk so far. Why? Because the Hudsons are not buried here. They're buried way over there near the Jane Street entrance. That's the Negro Cemetery. My grandfather, Frank Hudson, lived in Troopville. He often convened a group of people for worship every Sunday morning under a nearby bridge. That group of people, over time, became known as St. Paul AME Church here in Valdosta, Georgia today. You know, when the folk in Troopville decided to leave Troopville and come to Valdosta, you know, because the railroad came this way, my family came too. Instead of going south, north, where freedom, they decided to stay right here in the area and make it and strive to make it. My father was born in 1864. So you see, the Hudsons have been around Valdosta since Valdosta was Valdosta. My father was the very first Hudson to purchase property in Valdosta city limits. He established his home on that property, and it's on South Lee Street. It's called the Hudson House, built in 1890. And that house still stands there beautiful today. 120 years old. He bought property up and through the 1920s and built a chain of grocery stores. My father was the very first black man to own a chain of grocery stores in the state of Georgia. I later trekked to Atlanta, was asked to come to Atlanta to receive an award in my father's accomplishments. When he bought property, my dad, he not only bought a plot, he bought the entire tract and established his grocery stores on it as well. I had a proud family. We all work, young and old. No offense, no offense. In addition to supporting ourselves, we had, in addition to supporting ourselves with our prophetess and many prophetess, during that day, my father passed in January 1930. He left behind 3 kids. Hillary, my brother, Emily, 3 children. Aurelia, my sister, Hillary, my brother, and of course myself, being the oldest. I got married in 1929 to the biggest celebration of its kind up to that time. I married a young lady named Emily Goins. She's from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. We got married in Atlanta, Georgia, but the reception was held here in Valdosta, Georgia, for the community to meet and greet us. Emily was a graduate of Fisk University. She was an accomplished pianist and organist. She played piano. She taught and played piano. She accompanied singers that came to Valdosta, and she also played for St. Paul AME Church. It was said, ladies and gentlemen, that if a couple desired to get married, before they set the wedding date, they would see Emily to see if she was available to play for the wedding before they set the date. Emily was just that popular. Emily and I never had children of our own, but we felt the need of the children of the church, St. Paul AME Church, the family of the Hudson family, and the children of the community were ours to love and care for. During the Depression, Emily went to work for the U.S. government, Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, WPA, remember those from history. She went there to be trained and brought those skills back to Valdosta brought the skills back to Valdosta. In addition to mine overseeing the family businesses, I also was very active in the black community. I helped Georgia Power install electricity to our people's homes. Many a night. The power company and I, the representative and I, sat down at my kitchen table, figuring out how, where we could do best put these poles and wires, because our people were afraid of many over their home, where to put these poles and wires. We accomplished it. About that time, the city of Valdosta changed its code, requiring that all homes be equipped with at least one faucet and one toilet. No more of that outside stuff, chamber parts. I helped put in plumbing, and these small homes in my community, bathrooms in the rear, had one faucet that was required, was normally placed on the outside near the rear, came up to a little banister down the turn. Some of you probably remember that. That was mine idea. But it was just a start. All these things were just a start to build Valdosta the way it is. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I passed on in 1949. I was 52 years old. But my lovely wife, Emily, died in 1998, lived on for an additional 50 years after my death. And she's buried right over there with the rest of the Hudsons. And might I add, in my conclusion, the Hudsons were not the only black family instrumental in making Valdosta what it is. Many freed slaves came this way, established residency here, and made Valdosta what it is. So, under my guide, if you track over there to 4 soldiers, and you'll see the slave monument erected there, archery there, and there are soldiers there like to greet you as well as I did. Enjoy to you. Thank y'all. Here.
Years and years ago in time, a battalion encamped here. Some died and some were buried deep. Our friends were buried here. Our friends are buried here, oh pal. Our friends are buried here. Years and years ago in time, our friends were buried here. In slave days long ago, our people died like you. We buried them in this old ground, the friends of me and you. Our friends are buried here, oh pal. Our friends are buried here. Years and years ago in time, our friends were buried here.
Once, not so long ago, a lady saw some cemetery workers digging here, on this special spot, and she stopped them. "You're destroying your own heritage," she said. "This is where local slaves and members of the 103rd Infantry were buried back in the old days. Please stop digging. Don't destroy your heritage. Don't destroy your heritage."
Oh, long and long ago, pal, they died like you and me. In this old ground they sleep and rest for all eternity. Our friends are buried here, oh pal. Please take me at my word. From years and years ago in time, we honor the 103rd.
Welcome. It's good to see you here this afternoon. I'd like to take this time to welcome you to what we now call the slave section of Sunset Hill Cemetery. Years back, and for a long time after too, the 1860s, black people had no place to be buried, so they were buried here without markers or monuments. There are no markers today. There may have been at one time, but they're gone. Time and weather, well, they takes a toll. My name is Sergeant Doc Tucker, and I was 27 years old during those turbulent times. I rest easy now, but back then, well, life, it was hard and could be violent too. I was a sergeant in the 103rd United States Colored Infantry, which replaced the white soldiers of the United States Army in October 1865. I can tell you the people of Valdosta did not take kindly to our presence. We came to town and we set up a long row of tents downtown in the block along Patterson Street and Toon Street along West Hill Avenue.
And what a sight those little tents were, row after row and all neat looking, with little puffs of smoke from our campfire. We needed those campfires in those days to make coffee and to keep warm. And we needed lots of coffee those cold winter days. It was mighty cold and wet in those tents. The tents didn't have any beds or floors, so we slept on the ground. Yes, sirree. We sure did needed lots of hot coffee right bad those cold winter days of 1865. Well, as he said, the people of Valdosta sure didn't take kindly to us, but that's all history come and gone. And that war is over with, isn't it? We had a job to do, and we did it. So let us tell you a little bit about the occupation winter of 1865 and the spring of 1866.
You know, with all the unhappiness about us being in Valdosta, you can't imagine there were a lot of complaints, from all sides too. First of all, we were black soldiers, but we had a white commanding officer. Our commander, Captain Andrew W. Leonard, was a fair man, I guess, but Captain Leonard spent most of his time away on detached service, looking for deserters. In his absence, another white officer, First Lieutenant Alberto Marichetti, was in charge. Now that was one mean man. He had a mean-sounding name to my way of thinking, and he sure lived up to it. In fact, he was so mean we gave him a nickname and called him the Black Dutchman, which sure fit him to a T to my way of thinking. He just loved to torment people. Him and that Holiday boy, they didn't get along at all. Nope, not at all. Of course, he didn't get along with anybody else neither. Him and the young Force boy even had problems.
I remember Mr. Force talking some about his son Dick fighting with our troops. Young Force was a 19-year-old hothead, and we didn't mind mixing it up. So I guess that fight was just gonna happen. You know, young Dick Force's death went hard with that Holiday kid, but he managed to stay out of trouble that time. You know, it wasn't all fighting and anger. I remember some sweet times. I recall a little white boy who would come to town all dressed up fancy like with his father, and they would come by our encampment and talk with us. We enjoyed talking to that little guy, and we would call him Buck Rock out of respect. He was none too afraid of us, and he would ask lots of questions. You know, we would make up answers when we weren't too sure what the answer should be. Sometimes they would bring a freed woman of color who used to be a slave with the family, and she was very outspoken. You know, she would cuss us something fierce if we breathed wrong around the boy and his father. I don't recall the father's name, but I think they called that little guy Lewis. Yes, we sure do miss talking to him. You know, it was a hard, hard winter, and when the disease came, a lot of troops in 103rd died, and a lot of people in Valdosta too. And they laid us to rest here, in the slave section, and we'd rest easy in Sunset Cemetery.
Well, thank y'all for stopping by. That concludes our presentation, but I believe Mr. B.F. Strickland over there has some facts he'd like to share with you. Mr. Strickland, can you come down and talk to these folks? Thank you all.
Well, hello, folks. It's nice to see you all. And I'd like to welcome you here to the Strickland family section. I'm B.F. Strickland, but everyone always calls me Frank. I was born in 1854 and grew up during the Civil War. Later, I was quite a successful businessman right here in Valdosta. Was one of the officers of the Merchants Bank when it was first established back in 1888. Now, it was founded by Mr. Remmer Lane, and he served as our president for many years. We had 4 members on the board, and I was one of the directors. The other 3 were very fine gentlemen. Mr. A.T. Maguire, Mr. T.M. Smith, and Mr. W.T. Lane. We erected a nice 2-story building right on the northwest corner of South Patterson Street and Maidens Lane, and it served as our bank. Now, I got to tell you about Mr. Remmer Lane. For many years, he was a very familiar figure here in Valdosta. Do you know? For 15 years, for many hours every day, he'd set up a chair right in front of the bank, and he'd sit there for the whole town to see and just meet and greet folks as they went by. They considered him quite the character. But I'll tell you, smart. It wasn't many years before everybody in Valdosta knew Mr. Remmer Lane at the Merchants Bank. Well, in 1895, I got elected to city council. And I felt pretty good about that. But ladies and gentlemen, 1899 is the year you want to remember. That was the year that the Strickland Mill was open. Now, the Strickland Cotton Mill made it possible for the first time for us to process all the locally grown cotton right here in Valdosta instead of having to ship it away. That brought in many jobs, and that meant economic growth. Yeah. I want to tell you something, folks. The mill workers worked hard, and the mill was a success. The mill workers lived in small frame cottages that surrounded the mill. In fact, some of those cottages are still there to this day. Small town grew up near the mill. They named it Remmerton, after Remmer Lane, the president of the Valdosta Bank. Yep, the town was growing. We had churches, new schools, many fine teachers. I was proud of Remmerton, I was proud of Valdosta, and I was proud of the Strickland Mill. But Lowndes County was my home. And I was always eager to do whatever I could to promote its growth, any way I knew how. Why, in 1912, when the Valdosta Chamber of Commerce was organized, I joined right up. They asked me to serve on the board of directors, and I was glad to do it. They were very busy years, folks, very busy years. But they were good years. Good years. But you know what they say, all good things come to an end. And that was true for Frank Strickland too. I died in 1915, 61 years old at the time. And I was buried in that plot right over there with the urn. So, correction, my body's over there in that plot. As you can see, the spirit is still very active. Now right here is the family monument. Up on the top of it, they erected a statue of me after I died, and you notice they erected it facing west. Now that was instead of east, which was traditional. And the story was that they had it erected west so I could keep an eye on the mill. Well, actually, I don't think so, but it's a surprising, you'd be surprised how many people believe that story for a long time. Yeah, just a story. On second thought, though, maybe that's not such a bad idea. You know, keeping an eye on the goings-on over in Remmerton. Well, folks, I'm going to bid you farewell now. I want to thank you for dropping by. It's been fun sharing some of the highlights from my life with you. I'd like to invite you now to visit with Major Henry Holliday. He's the father of Dr. John Holliday. Now, you remember Doc Holliday. He was a friend of Wyatt Earp. Yeah, well, Major Henry has all kinds of tales and stories that he'd love to share with you. So I invite you to go over and have a visit with Major Henry. Thank you once again for dropping by, and say hello to Major Henry for me.
Well, folks, I'm Henry Holliday, and I'm buried right here. I died in 1893. I lived in Valdosta for 30 years, and I was right fond of this little city. I married Alice Jane Mackey at her home in McDonough, Georgia in 1849. When her father died, I was given guardianship of the younger children in the Mackey family, and we all lived in Griffin, Georgia, until we decided to move a bit further south to escape the approaching Union Army. I bought land in Lowndes County in what's now called the Bemis community. I built 2 small houses and slave quarters on the land and began to farm. I planted grapevines and soon had a vineyard producing grapes we used for making wine. I grew and sold all kinds of trees until my fellow Valdostans began to call me a horticulturist. I did introduce the pecan tree to Lowndes County in 1876. Now, I was guardian of Alice's younger siblings, as I said, and John Henry, well, you knew him as Doc. He was our only surviving child. John was a bit difficult, hard to handle. He was always getting into one kind of hot water or another. He got blamed for a good many things that were just not of his doing. And I guess he got away with a few things that he did but didn't get blamed for too. Now, when Alice Jane died in 1866, John took it real hard, and I was very worried about him. Now, when I married Rachel Martin 3 months after his mother's death, John had a difficult time accepting the situation. During this time, Rachel hankered to move out of the house that Jane and I lived in, and her father helped us buy a house in Valdosta near the railroad tracks on Savannah Avenue. John, of course, did not like the house, just as he did not like the marriage. Those were difficult days for all of us. It was about this time John indicated he was interested in studying dentistry. Now, that idea was a good one. I told him we'd pick out a school and I'd get the money for him somehow. Now, Dr. Lucian Frink, he was a local dentist, said he'd help all he could, and he did. Now, John had some trouble with the local Union battalion quartered here in Valdosta, and several people in the area believed he was involved in the attempt to dynamite the county courthouse. Well, in 1868, I was one of the men chosen to investigate that attempt. And I am pleased to report that John was shown to have nothing at all to do with that ill-advised attempt. I was also elected mayor of Valdosta in 1876. And I served several more times, but no records of my service exist. I was secretary of the Lowndes County Agricultural Society in 1875 and operated a large furniture store and was quite successful. Now, I was proud of John, but I was upset with him too. You see, he never got along well with Rachel, but he did work well with Dr. Frink and was successful in completing his course of study. Now, Dr. Frink was John's preceptor. That means he worked for Dr. Frink in a professional capacity while going to school. It was kind of like an apprenticeship, you'd say. Well, John went to dental college in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And when he left school, he went to work at a dental office in Atlanta. Now, while he worked hard to successfully complete his course of study, he couldn't practice dentistry for long, as he developed the same lung disease his mother had suffered from. Well, the doctors in Atlanta recommended he go west for his health. And the rest, as they say, is history. My son led a short and rather violent life, but we always loved him, and we always wished the very best for him. Well, thank you folks for stopping by. If you'll head over this way, you'll meet Mrs. Mamie Roberts Collins, and she'll tell you about an important first in her life.
Well, hello to all of you and welcome. I am Mamie Roberts Collins, and my grave is right here. I rest beside my dear mother, and this is where she is buried. Now, my father, Reuben Thompson, well, they called him Tompy Roberts. Well, he was the first mayor of Valdosta, but he is not buried here. You will notice we have a memorial stone for him. He was a soldier in the Army of the Confederacy and was wounded in a battle up in Tennessee the very year I was born, 1861. Sadly, he did not survive the amputation of his leg from that injury. He's buried in a cemetery up in Knoxville, but nobody has ever found his grave. Oh, well, many years later, Mr. What is his name? Oh, yes, Mr. R.T. Middleton. He was clerk of the court in Valdosta. Well, he told me he had found a record where my father signed some papers as mayor. Now, this verifies to my way of thinking that my father was Valdosta's very first mayor. Of course, all those records have been lost to fire and neglect. Oh, heavens, the courthouse has had a number of fires through the years, and many, many, many of the early records of Valdosta history were destroyed. Well, as for me, I married a Mr. L.M. Collins, had 3 children, Hattie, Eloise, and Tompy, named for my father, of course. Oh, we had a good life here in Valdosta. I never knew my father, but I do know he was an important part of Valdosta's early history. Oh, dear. Oh, the war years here in Georgia were such turbulent times, you know. And since he never returned, I only know about him through what other people have told me. listen to me just rambling away, taking up so much of your time. And why don't you all have a very nice day and have a visit next door with Dr. Thomas Williams Ellis. He'll tell you a few firsts in his life. Mm-hmm.
Well, hello there. Thank you, Miss Collins. Welcome to Sunset Hill Cemetery and my gravesite. My name is Dr. Thomas William Ellis. And yes, I do have some firsts in my life that I'm quite proud of. But before I tell you about these, however, I so want to tell you that I moved south with my family from North Carolina and settled in Georgia. We ended up coming to Troopville, where I served as a druggist. When Troopville was moved, because the railroad came to this area and missed the old Troopville site by 4 miles, I, for one, did not move right away. Stubborn, I suppose. But the railway passing us by, it ended the city, and slowly, over the years, people dismantled their houses. They moved them through the woods and set them up again in Valdosta. I came with several professional people. There was William Ashley, a physician, Henry Briggs, a planter, oh yes, and Powhatan B. Whittle, a lawyer, a direct descendant of Powhatan, the father of Pocahontas. Well, when I finally moved to Valdosta, I was the first druggist with the first drugstore. My store sat right on the northeast corner of Central and Ashley Avenue. I was also a Methodist minister, and my son followed me into this profession. My granddaughter, Leila Ellis, well, she was a well-known school teacher and principal in Valdosta. In fact, they named a school for Leila, the Leila Ellis Elementary on North Lee Street. I died on February the 27th, 1861. And guess what, folks? I was the very first person buried in our cemetery. Here's the date, right here, 1861. So, there you have it, 2 firsts, the first drugstore and the first person buried in our cemetery. I'm quite pleased with the first, though the second first was sort of forced on me, you could say. Well, that's life, I guess. I see it's time now that you go over and hear from our very first newspaper man, Mr. Philip C. Pendleton.
Welcome. I'm Philip Pendleton. I was born in Eatonton, Georgia in 1812. My father was Coleman Pendleton from Virginia. My mother was Martha Gilbert Pendleton, the daughter of a Revolutionary soldier. My father was an itinerant preacher, and I lived in many places in Georgia before settling here in Valdosta. Along the way, I established 3 newspapers and a literary quarterly. I died in 1869, and I was laid to rest right here in Sunset Hill Cemetery. While I lived in Savannah, I met and I married Miss Catherine Sarah Melissa Tebow. I was a teacher, a writer, and a lawyer. I was a Macon volunteer, and I fought in the Seminole War, and later in the Confederate Army. My lovely wife and I, we moved to Valdosta in late 1864. We settled south of town on Old Whitewater Road, and in March of 1867, I founded the South Georgia Times. In a scheme to bring more settlers to this area, I was persuaded by a group of prominent businessmen and farmers to go on a recruiting mission to Scotland. The primary group responsible for funding this mission was to be the Lowndes County Agriculture Society. They made many promises to me for funding the mission. So, with promises in hand, I set sail for Europe. But unfortunately, the promises never materialized, and I returned to Valdosta. And after a long discussion and debate about the promised funds for the mission, I finally set sail again, but this time for London. But unfortunately, that trip too ended in a failure. And I had letters of introduction to parties in London and Liverpool, and points in Scotland and Germany. But again, the funds were not forthcoming, and I barely escaped with my life from an angry mob in Scotland. Thus twice unsuccessful, I returned home to Valdosta. And while I was away, the lack of funds put a severe strain on my family. My wife and boys, who were all in their teen years, continued to keep the newspaper going at great cost to themselves. I am very proud of them for their industry and their willingness to work so hard at a young age. Years after that episode, I'd often thought of the time that I left my family alone for months on end for some fancy scheme that failed. The boys were young and inexperienced and perhaps lacked the responsibility. But they were happy to do it. Or were they? You know, I was never sure. But perhaps the responsibility was good for them. I returned from Scotland in 1868, and we moved into Valdosta from the old Whitewater Road, and I put 8 out of 10 of my children through the Valdosta Institute. The very next year, in 1869, I met with a buggy accident, and it took my life. 1 year later, my son Philo died of the fever. And Charles, Lewis, James, and Andy seemed to take over the newspaper. And they kept it going. But it was Charles who stayed with it for 25 years. That is, till he moved to Macon, and he bought the Macon Telegraph. Well, we're all gone now. But the Valdosta Times, it lives on, and I am pleased to see that. And it's exciting to see Valdosta celebrating its 150th year. Thank you for visiting with me and for coming out and joining us on our sesquicentennial stroll through our beautiful historic cemetery. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a wonderful day. And by the way, before you leave, I was pondering a few thoughts, if I may. It's entitled, At Peace. I sleep and therefore begin to dream, a place of which I have never seen. Is this fiction or is this fantasy? Please do not wake me. It is better than reality. For in this state I feel no pain, not like reality when it comes from the brain. It seems as though my body is calm, as is a baby in its mother's loving arms. With those few thoughts, I was shown to a gate. It was that moment, and only that moment, that I knew I would never awake.